Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I am joined by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, how are you?
Hello, Stephen. I think this is the first time we've ever done this together. Am I right?
I think you're right. I think you are right. I'm looking forward to it.
What a treat.
What a treat. Coming up tonight, Elon Musk secures his place in Trump's incoming administration. Hooray. Wes Streeting announces new NHS reforms, and I speak to Dr Feroze Sidwha, a trauma surgeon and author of a New York Times report on child casualties in Gaza. And I really want to encourage you to stay tuned for that because it's an incredibly powerful, revealing, and candid interview. US President-elect Donald Trump has wasted no time in making a swathe of appointments just 1 week after winning the White House. Many have been hugely controversial and involve people with really zero previous government experience. For example, former Fox News host Pete Hegseth as Defense Secretary. But one pick in particular is grabbing headlines today.
It has now been confirmed that Elon Musk will be the head of a new government Department of Efficiency that will, oddly, we don't understand quite how this works, but oddly sit outside government. That may be because Elon Musk is in charge of several companies who have massive government contracts, which prevents him from working within government, but somehow they've fudged it. And so he will sit outside government, heading up this Department of Government Efficiency alongside Vivek Ramaswamy. Donald Trump has said overnight, I look forward to Elon and Vivek making changes to the federal bureaucracy with an eye on efficiency and at the same time making life better for all Americans. He goes on to say, importantly, we will drive out the massive waste and fraud which exists throughout our annual $6.5 trillion of government spending. So that is those two characters having a central role, albeit outside of government, but certainly looking at government efficiency in a Trump second term, something that Donald Trump has promised that he would do with Elon Musk's help.
Trump announced the governmental, non-governmental department's formation in a statement where he said this: together, these two wonderful Americans will pave the way for my administration to dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies. It will become, potentially, the Manhattan Project of our time. Now, the Manhattan Project was the US-led research and development program that saw the production of the first nuclear weapons during the Second World War. So it's not really clear what Trump means by that. Does he mean that the US will test the department on civilian centers in Japan? Who knows? After handing out $1 million per day to voters in swing states via his political group America PAC, Musk has been richly rewarded with a newly department named after Doge. That's the meme featuring a Shiba Inu dog and a strain of cryptocurrency backed by, you guessed it, Elon Musk. The value of Dogecoin has more than doubled since Trump won a second term, and shares in Tesla, also owned by Musk, are up by nearly 40%. Following the announcement, Musk posted this on X, formerly known as Twitter. All actions of the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, will be posted online for maximum transparency. Anytime the public thinks we are cutting something important or not cutting something wasteful, just let us know. We will also have a leaderboard for most insanely dumb spending of your tax dollars. This will be both extremely tragic and extremely entertaining. Probably will be quite entertaining, actually. As Trump's perhaps highest profile supporter, was Musk gearing up for exactly this kind of role during the election campaign? Here's what the world's richest man, or so he's described, said at a Trump rally last month.
How much do you think we can rip out of this wasted $6.5 trillion Harris-Biden budget?
Well, I think we can do at least $2 trillion.
Yeah!
Yes.
2 trillion.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're being taxed. You're being taxed. All government spending is taxation. So whether it's direct taxation or all government spending, it either becomes inflation or it's direct taxation. Your money is being wasted, and the Department of Government Efficiency is going to fix that. We're going to get the government off your back and out of your pocketbook. And America's just not just going to be great. America is going to reach heights that it has never seen before. The future is going to be amazing.
Joining Musk on the Doge team is another billionaire, Vivek Ramaswamy. Ramaswamy is an entrepreneur and biotech and pharmaceuticals who ran against Trump for the Republican Party nomination back in February 2023. In January this year, he dropped out of the race and quickly endorsed the future president. It seems that Donald J. Trump isn't one to hold a grudge against former rivals as long as they kiss the ring. During his unsuccessful bid for the Republican nomination, Ramaswamy had some big ideas for reducing government spending. This is Ramaswamy last year explaining what he'd do as president.
My first term in office, 75% headcount reduction across the federal employee base, 50% done in the first year. Take the government agencies that should not exist, from the FBI to the IRS to the ATF to the CDC to the Department of Education. Get in there and shut them down.
The Department of Education shouldn't exist. The IRS shouldn't exist. The FBI should. Nothing should exist. Nothing should exist except billionaires and their businesses, presumably. Neither Ramaswamy nor Musk has obviously ever held a governmental post. Dalia, this is, I don't know, the bonfire of the billionaires, except they're not the ones burning up. It's government departments, civil servants, regulations. What do you make of it?
I mean, it's such a particularly perverse thing that keeps happening in this moment where the so-called anti-establishment movement, which is a movement that is entirely funded and fronted by the establishment, is somehow, like, I don't understand how they've managed to get away, the Trump movement, with framing themselves as anti-establishment whilst being filled to the brim with billionaires who are by default the establishment. They are by default the people who are winning the most from the existing system that we have. But I guess there's something peculiarly American about that kind of love of extreme wealth and that association between extreme wealth and, you know, moral value or intelligence, that even people who are being screwed over by that system and by those very billionaires somehow still have this kind of they're very enamored with anyone who has extreme wealth. And that really is the kind of the cultural cachet that Trump is trafficking off alongside Elon Musk. But it is worth mentioning specifically with Elon Musk's appointment. Obviously, this is not technically a traditional government position, but we can certainly say that Musk is going to be very much involved, at least in a satellite capacity, with the US state. And there's been a lot of conversations ever since Trump entered the political scene about whether or not Trumpism can count as a form of fascism, whether it clears the threshold for fascism. Now, obviously, your answer to that depends on what definition of fascism you're taking. But one definition of fascism that is quite commonly understood and commonly cited is by someone who has a lot of expertise in the nature of fascism, which is Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, who identified fascism as the complete allegiance between state and corporate power. And so whatever you might have thought about all the other things that we could consider potential markers of fascism, you know, things like, the cult of tradition, the fear of difference, the construction of an internal enemy, the selective populism, etc. What we can say is that this very scary folding in together of corporate power and state power certainly does clear one of the most commonly identifiable markers of at least the beginnings of a fascist infrastructure. Because what we are talking about here is a man who pretty much single-handedly owns the largest global telecommunications infrastructure that the world has ever seen. And for him to both own that, first of all, for him to own it single-handedly in itself is highly authoritarian. But for that to now be folded in to a form of state, at least a state-adjacent power, is incredibly scary, because what we're looking at here is an extreme concentration of power. We're looking at a tool, Twitter or X or whatever, has a proven ability to manipulate and cultivate public consciousness And we also have this unique thing of the scale of data extraction that can take place via Twitter. Twitter is essentially a data extraction vehicle. And it's very concerning that that vehicle is now becoming extremely close to state power, if not part of state power in itself. And so this to me is a quite a discernible shift. If we're going to talk about, whether or not this is a pathway to fascism, for me, this moment of Musk being appointed into this made up position and probably going to be given a bunch of made up, unintelligible powers, this is to me a marked shift in that process. But even if we can't say that this is a move that is kind of fascist adjacent or is on the road to fascism, what we can absolutely say is that this move finally really does highlight in an inescapable way that capitalism is completely cannibalizing our democracy. Now, for some of us, some of us believed that capitalism and democracy have never been compatible. I'm one of those people. I think in a system where, capital is above everything and some people can accumulate huge amounts of that capital off the back of others, that is inevitably going to translate into other forms of power. But even for people who might have believed in, this free market ideology, that the best rises to the top, that everyone can have a shot, surely now it is inescapable that when you have someone who has this huge amount of wealth, this huge amount of literally engineered social and cultural capital, and now a hand in the state, arguably, I don't think anyone can honestly now say that capitalism is not the most significant threat to our democracy in this moment.
In other appointment news, Trump has named the former Arkansas governor Mike Huckabee as U.S. ambassador to Israel. In a statement, the president-elect said this: Mike has been a great public servant, governor, and leader in faith for many years. He loves Israel and the people of Israel, and likewise the people of Israel love him. Mike will work tirelessly to bring about peace in the Middle East. Now, peace is a very strange word choice here. Mike Huckabee is considered an incredibly hawkish appointment. He opposes Palestinian statehood, and in 2016 he made these comments.
Basically, there really is no such thing as, and I have to be careful in saying this because people will really get upset, there's really no such thing as a Palestinian. There's not. You have Arabs and Persians. You don't, and there's such complexity within that. There's really no such thing. That's been a political tool to try to force land away from Israel.
At an event in the West Bank in 2017, he also refuted the idea that the West Bank even exists. He said this: "There are certain words I refuse to use. There is no such thing as a West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as a settlement. They're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're cities. There's no such thing as an occupation." The entire globe is against that through the UN. The UN has clearly stated that the West Bank is under occupation. Huckabee is a former evangelical minister who regularly leads trips called the Israel Experience that takes tour groups to sites with biblical and historical significance. He had 2 failed bids for the Republican nomination in 2008 and 2016, and his daughter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, served as a Trump White House press secretary and is now the sitting governor of Arkansas. Israeli ambassador to the UN, David Danon, said this about Huckabee's appointment.
I want to congratulate my dear friend, Governor Mike Huckabee. I think he will be a great ambassador to Israel. He's very familiar with the facts on the ground. I think he visited Israel dozens of times. He had like a yearly visit to Israel, and I had the honor to escort him. Also, after October 7th, he came, and I took him to visit the sites on Kfar Aza, Be'eri, and other locations where the massacre took place. So we will welcome him, and we will be expecting his arrival.
Trump has also chosen his regular golf partner, Steve Witkoff, a property investor and landlord, as special envoy to the Middle East. Witkoff was seen as a conduit to the Jewish business community during Trump's successful presidential campaign. He is not known to have any experience in diplomacy or the Middle East. Dalia, yesterday we saw the announcement of the appointment of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, now Huckabee as ambassador to Israel. This is very bad news for Palestine, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible news. Obviously, the Democrats were terrible for Palestinians in many ways. In one clearly obvious way for Gaza, for Palestinians in Gaza, they have absolutely no problem with fueling the genocide and apartheid regimes, and machines literally providing the weaponry and the finance and everything for Israel to execute de facto apartheid and genocide. What we are seeing, but what the Democrats did was they offered some kind of at least gesturing towards this idea of some vague political representation for the Palestinians. Arguably, it was political representation that actually didn't translate to much or was very tokenistic because it was not tied to actual sovereignty and rights as a nation. But what we can see in this Trump administration is going to be a continuation of the militaristic and financial support of Israel's genocidal ambitions and apartheid, alongside a compounding effort to also remove whatever kinds of tokenistic political representation Palestinians had. But Stephen, I think that you really raise an interesting and important dynamic here when you refer to Mike Huckabee's specific personal history with Israel. Mike Huckabee comes from the evangelical Christian movement in the US, which is an extremely powerful political movement in the US. And he's also very much a leading advocate of Christian Zionism. When you look at which communities in the US actually have the most solidly consensus-based commitment to the project of Zionism, it's actually not American Jews. It's not the American Jewish community. There has been actually a lot of dissent within the American Jewish community, for decades, and especially now, we are seeing that American Jews are amongst some of the most militant when it comes to solidarity with the Palestinians globally. Actually, it's evangelical Christians that have the strongest, most universal support and commitment to the project of Zionism. Of the 900,000 Americans that travel to Israel every year, half of those are Christians, and many of those kinds of tours are the exact kinds of tours. They're kind of like a quasi birthright sort of tour, but for Christian Zionists. Many of those were actually organized and led by Mike Huckabee himself. So this is not a satellite or fringe figure within this movement. This is someone who has been absolutely at the heart of the Christian Zionist movement in the US, which has been very influential in American foreign policy and has been very influential in US elections. But the great irony is that Christian Zionists, the basis of their support for Israel is some of the most anti-Semitic garbage you could ever conceive of in your life. Like the fundamental logic that they have is that in order for a biblical prophecy of Armageddon to take place, every Jewish person in the world has to go to Israel. And once every Jewish person in the world is in Israel, Armageddon will happen, Christians will be saved, and everyone who's not an evangelical Christian will descend into hell, or I don't know what's going to happen. Now, this is like religious fanaticism on another scale. Like it's bonkers. And yet this has had such a fundamental influence and has been so deeply powerful when it comes to structuring US foreign policy. Like alongside AIPAC, Christian Zionists are some of the most important lobbyists that have shaped the US's relationship with Israel. And yet it is rooted in the fundamental belief of white Christian people in the US, of white Christian evangelicals, their fundamental belief in an expulsion narrative around Jewish people all throughout the world and in the US. These are people who literally want Jewish people around the world to be arguably like pushed out of the countries in which they live, that they call home, and pushed into Israel. So it is this uncanny combination of white supremacy, Christian fanaticism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, all in one disgusting knot that we're now calling Mike Huckabee.
And that we're now calling Trump's cabinet as well, I guess. Yeah, horrifying times ahead, I think. The Health and Social Care Secretary, Wes Streeting, has announced that failing hospitals will be named and shamed in league tables, with hospital managers getting the sack if they don't turn things around. In the Labour government's first foray into health service reform, Streeting announced a, quote, no-holds-barred sweeping review of NHS performance. Here's Streeting at the annual NHS Providers Conference today.
When we were last in government, we recognised that not everything could or should be run from the centre. New Labour's reform agenda created foundation trusts, increased patient choice, and used financial incentives to raise performance and increase transparency. In doing so, they oversaw dramatic falls in waiting times and increased public satisfaction to the highest levels on record. I really can't explain what happened in the next 14 years, but I hope that someone somewhere is writing a PhD on how it was that a party of the right, setting out to liberate the NHS, ended up with far more centralised control and far weaker public accountability. But the legacy of their botched reforms we are living with. It's been mismanaged decline and a confusion over who is supposed to be doing what in the system and an absence of any governance philosophy. The framework I'm setting out today is based on triple devolution, with power shifting out of the centre to ICBs, to providers, and crucially to patients. I want to lead an NHS where power is moved from the centre to the local and from the local to the citizen. Morrison meets Bevan.
Streeting's package of NHS reforms emphasises a decentralised approach and patient choice, alongside Ofsted-style league tables and penalties for hospitals that score poorly on financial management and care delivery.
Over the past decade, provider freedoms have been curtailed. I view that as a retrograde step. Starting with the best performing trust, providers should be given greater freedom and flexibility to innovate, run community services, and manage their own house to meet the needs of their patients. The last Labour government had a philosophy of earned autonomy. I want to go further and faster than my predecessors did. Our long-term ambition is that all providers should enjoy the same freedoms as foundation trusts, so long as they deliver improved performance. And critically, those ICBs that perform best, particularly in developing neighbourhood health services, should also enjoy greater freedom and flexibility. We will no longer treat all providers and ICBs as if they are all performing equally, when you and I know it's a mixed ability class. We'll assess systems against a set of criteria and publish the results starting from next year. Those systems and providers that are in the middle of the pack will get support to improve, to bring them to where the best are now. Those ICBs and providers that are doing well will be rewarded with greater freedoms over how to spend their capital, with fewer ring fences, for example. Those that demonstrate the best financial management will get a greater share of capital allocation. We want to move to a system where freedom is the norm and central grip is the exception to challenge poor performance. So improving services for patients should be rewarded, and the quid pro quo is that there'll be no more rewards for failure.
No more rewards for failure. I really don't think in the last 14 years there have been many rewards for either failure or success in the NHS. But anyway, the Health Secretary also announced that a new pay framework for chief executives will be published in April. This will clamp down on poorly performing leaders of NHS trusts and integrated care boards, or ICBSs. Discussing those leaders on the Today programme, Streeting didn't hold back.
Where we have poorly performing senior managers, I'll make no apology for managing those people out, because people know, and this is the guilty secret of the NHS. There are very senior managers who are paid on average, let's not forget, £145,000 a year, who are managed out, given a payoff in one trust, and then reincarnate in another NHS trust. And those might be the rotten apples, and I want to recognise that there are some outstanding leaders right across the NHS, but those rotten apples are unacceptable.
Now, the Health Secretary's tough love approach has been received as bitter medicine by professional organisations. Dr Adrian Boyle, president of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, warned that the plans could risk demoralising staff and make recruitment and retention in poorly performing areas even harder. One senior Labour MP also took umbrage with Streeting's language, telling Politico that, quote, people who run our NHS know how to be efficient and innovate, and private providers could learn a lot from our NHS. And former Labour leader and independent MP for Islington North, Jeremy Corbyn, slammed the idea of hospital league tables, posting this. Hospital league tables are a disastrous idea. You do not improve standards by shaming hard-working NHS staff, damaging morale, and adding unnecessary stress. We should support, not scapegoat, our medics. That means giving them the resources they need to provide care for all. Dalia, Ofsted is coming to the NHS. What do you think?
Look, I don't work in healthcare, so I can't comment on what it would feel like to receive this news as a healthcare worker, but I do work in a field that has been very heavily impacted and is very much run by league tables, which is higher education. And I can tell you that league tables don't tell you anything about the actual quality of service that's being provided, and they actually don't achieve any of the goals that they're meant to achieve. What happens with league tables, and it's interesting that Wes Streeting frames this as like an anti-bureaucrat measure. In fact, the introduction of league tables, what it tends to do is it tends to overinflate the role and focus on bureaucrats who are employed pretty much to game the system of these league tables. Because what league tables do is they pick out these markers that mark whether or not a service is good or an institution is good. They rip those markers out of their context and then compare institutions and trusts that might be operating in radically different contexts and puts them into direct competition and comparison with one another. And that ends up meaning that we become much more focused on these kinds of quite often quite misleading quantitative markers at the expense of actually a qualitative interest in what is going to work for a particular institution in a particular place. So an example that I can give you is one thing that students often say that they want more of is contact hours, which means basically more hours that they spend with, directly face-to-face with an educator. Now, that makes a lot of sense. So that's been integrated into the league table. How many contact hours does each student get? But what they're neglecting to add into that is the fact that if you're just increasing the number of hours to tick a box, but you're you're not increasing wages in line with inflation, you're cutting staff, you're cutting admin staff, you're cutting resources, you're cutting budgets, you're gutting departments of their ability to function, then the fact that students just have more hours with an educator often doesn't actually translate to the thing that the students actually want from that time. So this is basically all about introducing this very fallible market logic. And that was, dripping from Wes Streeting's lips when he's talking. He's talking about, empowering the individual and rewarding good behavior and competition and all of these things. It's about introducing a market logic to give the illusion that things are improving because you create markers that you can measure and improve against without actually addressing any of the core things that institutions like healthcare and education need, which is very simple. Educators, healthcare workers, etc., they need more space, they need more time, they need good wages. That's what they need. It's pretty simple. And trying to come up with all of these algorithms and these, formulas and whatever to create this number that you can attach and put people in competition with one another, I think it's absolutely right that what that does is it makes us focus on the things that are, outlined in those markers in quite a reductive way, and not actually spending those time and resources giving teachers, healthcare workers, all these kinds of public sector workers, the things that they have been asking for many years now about what they actually need to do their job properly.
Yeah, absolutely. When box ticking exercises and league tables become the way in which you access funds and freedom, then your core function becomes gaming, box ticking exercises and league tables rather than the function that you're supposed to be supplying, whether it be higher education, primary education, or the health service. That's a pretty well understood phenomenon, I think. Let's go to our next story. And I should say before we start, it discusses content that some may find disturbing.
There's constant drones. The drones existed before October last year. It's been a feature of Palestinian life for some time. But now the drones inspire fear, I think, and they inspire fear in me. And when I used to debate about sleeping outside on the stairs or inside in this very crowded hot room Part of that decision was whether the drones had the ability to pick me off when I was on the stairs.
Identify you?
Sorry?
Identify you?
No, shoot me. So that's what they do. Those drones are surveillance drones, but they are also drones that shoot people regularly. So the drones would come down and pick off civilians, children. And we had description after description. This is not, an occasional thing. This was day after day after day, operating on children who would say, I was lying on the ground after a bomb had dropped, and this quadcopter came down and hovered over me and shot me. And that's clearly a deliberate act, and it was a persistent act, persistent targeting of civilians. The bullets that the drones fire are these small cuboid pellets, and I fished a number of those out of the abdomen of small children. I think the youngest I operated on was a 3-year-old who had a major injury to the artery in her neck, and we used the last shunt, which is a device you use to bypass the artery in the neck to keep supplying blood to the brain. We used the last one in the hospital because those kinds of things are just not available. She died about 3 or 4 days later from infection. You would have people with blast injuries, abdominal injuries, chest injuries, limbs blown off, head injuries. We saw a number of children with sniper injuries to the head, single shot to the head, no other injuries. So clearly deliberately targeted by Israeli snipers. And yeah, that was day after day. With the drone pellets, what I found was they would go in and they would bounce around. So they would cause multiple injuries. So I had a 7-year-old boy, the one I described earlier, who gave a very clear description. He had an entry point here. He came in with his stomach hanging out of his chest. He had an injury to his liver, spleen. Bowel, arteries. So quite extensive destruction from a single entry point. And he survived that and went out a week later. Whether he's still alive, I don't know.
That was the testimony of Nizam Mahmood, a professor of transplantation surgery who worked at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis earlier this year. He was speaking before the International Development Committee in Parliament last week. Responding to his testimony, committee chair Sarah Champion said this. Professor Mahmood told us that he has worked in a number of dangerous conflict zones, including the Rwandan genocide. Yet still, he had never seen anything on the scale of what he saw in Gaza. This view was no outlier. It was also that of his experienced colleagues, one of whom had traveled to Ukraine several times. He saw children with sniper injuries to the head, children shot by drones, evidence, he said, of targeting by the Israeli ministry. The committee will do all they can to act on Professor Mahmoud's extraordinary testimony and ensure his experiences are heard loud and clear. If leaders are not yet listening, they should be by now. Now, it's far from the first time we've heard such harrowing testimony from doctors and other medical professionals working in Gaza. And to be frank, it's far from the first time we've heard politicians promise action in response, only for Israel's genocide to roll on completely unaffected by the words of Western leaders. Some doctors who spoke out even became the targets of political retribution. Dr. Hassan Abusita is a British plastic reconstructive surgeon. He volunteered in Gaza for 43 days at the outset of Israel's war. While working at Al-Shifa Hospital, his family was questioned by the Metropolitan Police. In August this year, he was exonerated by the General Medical Council after an Israeli pressure group complained that a post he'd made on social media made him unfit to practice as a doctor. And before that, Germany imposed a Schengen area ban on Abusita, meaning that he was prevented from attending talks about the genocide in Germany, in France, and in the Netherlands. That ban was later overturned, but it shows the extraordinary lengths Western states and institutions will go to silence eyewitnesses to the terror Israel is inflicting on Gaza. Here is another courageous doctor who spoke about the genocide. Dr Feroze Sidwha worked at the European Hospital in Khan Yunis in March, and in October he published a piece in the New York Times. Gathering the evidence of 65 medical workers in Gaza, it's a comprehensive account of the complex and violent traumatic injuries suffered by Palestinians in Gaza, including large numbers of children. Now, we covered this report in October, but here are the horrendous details again. 44 doctors, nurses, and paramedics saw multiple cases of preteen children who had been shot by a single bullet in the head or chest in Gaza. An anesthesiologist from Ohio who volunteered in Gaza reported this. I saw many children. In my experience, the gunshot wound was often to the head. Many had non-curable permanent brain damage. It was almost a daily occurrence to have children arrive at the hospital with gunshot wounds to the head. And another doctor said this. I had multiple pediatric patients, mostly under the age of 12, who were shot in the head or the left side of the chest. Usually these were single shots. The patients came in either dead or critical and died shortly after arriving. That wasn't all. It wasn't nearly all. Dr. Sidwha's survey also found that 52 medical workers found nearly universal psychiatric distress amongst Gaza's children, including suicidality, with 63 of the medical workers encountering severe malnutrition in patients, Palestinian medical workers, and the general population of Gaza. Now, those are only some of the findings laid out in that New York Times article. And if you haven't read it already, I really encourage you to seek it out. But earlier today, I was joined by its author, Feroze Sidwha, from his office in California. And I began by asking him about what the response to his article has been.
Popularly, I think the reaction has been positive, may not be the right word, but people have reacted with shock and horror, which I think is appropriate. Interestingly, there have been a few interesting reactions. One was the letters that the New York Times chose to publish about the article. Two of them apparently didn't even understand the purpose of the article. I don't think they read it. This is very strange. The one was critical of my call for an arms embargo, or our call for an arms embargo, and it was just such a strange thing to say. Oh, I don't think we need to have an arms embargo yet. It's too soon, or it's been a year. So I'm not really sure what that person was trying to say. The next critical letter was from two people who are associated with, I believe it's the Jewish American Medical Society or some such thing, and their letter said that the piece was hurtful and other such things, and I understand that. I said that I don't think they shouldn't be allowed to have such a reaction, but why was the New York Times trying to make this into something that's against Jews? It's a very, very strange choice to publish that letter by identifying these people as associated with the Jewish American Medical Association, as if the article was somehow an attack on Jewish people or Jewish physicians. It was very odd. And then it was only the third letter that said that actually understood what the point of the article was. So the last line of the article, after running through, for people who haven't read it, just after running through a poll that I took of physicians and nurses who have been in Gaza about the certain things they saw: the shooting of children, the targeting of children with gunfire, starvation of the population, targeting of healthcare workers, other such things. Afterwards, that person said, "How can we be involved in this? This is so awful. This is just this terrible." That was the point of the article. The last line of the article is, "When this is over, we need to take a long, hard look at ourselves." The article is not about Israel; it's about our support for Israel. And I found it very strange that even the New York Times didn't seem to understand that. But popularly, I'll tell you that the reaction to the article is just horror. People just normal people don't have any. They don't come up with exotic reasons that 65 American healthcare workers are somehow in some bizarre conspiracy of lying about these things. There was all this nonsense on Twitter or whatever people use, saying that the CT images that we had at the beginning of the piece were faked. That's just pure nonsense. Interestingly enough, even doctors are willing to lie about this in public. I was shocked by that. There were two physicians who wrote for some website called thejurist.org or something, who not only said that we were lying, that these CT images were faked, they went to the point of just stating pure medical nonsense about how you can see brain injury, just things that anybody who's gone to medical school knows full well are obviously untrue. And then going so far as to say that the people who participated in this article, or not to say, but to imply that the people who participated in the poll, and certainly me, should actually lose their protections as humanitarian healthcare workers when they go back. Well, that means Israel will kill us. That's outrageous. I mean, I am. There are not many things that shock me anymore, but it was pretty shocking to see two American physicians, one an anesthesiologist and one a trauma surgeon, one at Dartmouth and one at Tufts University, so not small, not unheard of places, say such things. It's just outrageous. And furthermore, there's been no consequences for their actions. So why not say it? Why not just say any crazy nonsense as a doctor that you want, if your institution will allow it? But overall, the piece, the reaction to the piece has just been exactly what I expected with normal human beings, which is to say, my God, how can number one, how can this be happening? But number two, and much more importantly, how can we be responsible for it? That's awful.
Yeah, I think that reaction of horror, as well as the reaction by people who are perhaps in support of Israel, trying to create a sort of noise or fog around your findings, isn't surprising, because many of the findings are truly horrific. One in particular is just the frequency with which doctors and nurses and other medical workers in Gaza were encountering children with single gunshot wounds to the head. What can you tell us about your experiences of those kinds of injuries?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the article, I told a story that some people assumed was made up, or says, again, strange responses to these things. But I told a story. So when I was there, I kept a journal, and the journal probably only captured about half of the cases I saw, maybe even less. But when I came back, a reporter at the Washington Post asked me to send them the journal. So I did, and so I just read through it before I did that, and I realized that I had seen 13 children shot in the head in 14 days, or that I had documented that I had seen this, and so I may have seen more. The time there is definitely a blur. And I had gone to a conference, I think in Michigan somewhere, and I'd sat next to Thayer Ahmed. He's an emergency medicine doctor in Chicago, who's also been to Gaza, and he told me that, or when we sat next to each other, I just kind of casually mentioned, you were in Gaza, and nice to meet you. One thing that just blew me away was how many kids I saw shot in the head. And his response was, "Oh yeah, me too. Every single day I saw kids shot in the head," and that surprised me, because I had assumed that there was just some either sadistic sniper or drone team or whatever around Gaza, or around the European hospital where I was, that was doing these things. But when I spoke to him about it, I realized maybe this is actually more widespread. Now it's important to remember the vast majority of children who are being injured and killed in Gaza are being injured in explosions, airstrikes, tank shellings, artillery shelling, drone attacks with missiles, whatever it might be. But the reason that I focused on the shooting of children with single gunshots to the head is because it makes it kind of impossible to deny that they were targeted. Certainly one kid that gets shot in the head, okay, yeah, that could have been in a crossfire or an accident or something like that. 2 kids, okay, fine. But when throughout the Gaza Strip for a year, in the catchment area of every hospital where an international has been present, children are getting shot in the head on a regular, if not daily basis, that's not believable. That's an accident. That's clearly deliberate on the people on the part of the people who are doing the shooting. And it seems quite obvious that it's just being tolerated by the Israeli military, and they have no incentive to stop it and no reason to, because the US won't force them to.
Yeah, we had strikingly similar testimony last week in Parliament from a British surgeon called Nizam Mahmood, who described targeting of children by quadcopters in Gaza, really offering horrific details of the kind of injuries that they received then. Another aspect of your report deals with the widespread psychiatric and psychological distress that people in Gaza are enduring. Can you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, so it's important to remember what Gaza was on October 6th of 2023, the day before the Hamas attack. Gaza had been subjected to a blockade, literally a military blockade that started in 2007, long time ago. In 2008, just a year later, and 16, 17 years ago now, Mary Robinson, the international elder, former president of Ireland, she visited Gaza. This is just after 1 year of the blockade. And she said their whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. Those are all her words. And then she went on to say that it's unbelievable that the world doesn't care about this while it's happening. After that, since then, I should say, Gaza has been subjected to, I think it's 12 Israeli military attacks. The three most destructive were Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 9, and then Operation Polar Defense in 2012, and then Operation Protective Edge in 2014. After Operation Protective Edge, the president of the International Committee for the Red Cross, whose job it is to go to horrendous disaster zones, said, and this is 2014, 11 years ago, he said, I have never in my life seen destruction on this scale. It blew him away. He was just completely shocked by it. Sarah Roy, who's probably the world's leading expert on the Gaza Strip, she lived there for a long time. She knows the place very well. She works at Harvard's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. She wrote after the 2014 attack that, I'm quoting almost exactly as best I can remember, in all the years that I've been studying Gaza, I have never seen the human, psychological, and physical devastation that I see there today. And she went on to say that this is creating an incredibly dangerous situation, not only for Palestinians in Gaza, but also for Israel, because everyone in Gaza is losing hope that peace with Israel is even possible. Now, then you come to the Great March of Return, 2018, a festive, open, not even slightly violent in its first 6 months, not so much as a stone being thrown. What does Israel do? Israel builds berms right outside of Gaza, lines snipers up on them, and for 6 months shoots people dead. No threat, nothing. Well, so yeah, these people have been subjected to absolute terror for their entire lives. And you also have to remember, Gaza is a very, very young territory. Half the population, literally half the population, is under 18. 15% of people are under the age of 5. So most of them have grown up only in the most extreme version of the Israeli occupation, which is the blockade and the periodic military attacks on Gaza. So then comes October 7th, and now the entire place has been obliterated. Well, now you have some very unusual psychological phenomenon being kind of rearing up now. The most shocking one is suicidality among children. And I'm not talking about 17-year-olds. I'm talking about 5-year-olds. Children who regularly say they wish they were dead, who wish they had died with their families, who wish they could see. This is not a common scenario. I've worked in Ukraine. I've worked in Zimbabwe. I've worked in Haiti. I have never encountered a child, a toddler, who said they wanted to die. That's very, very uncommon. And this is seen universally throughout Gaza. Every medical team that goes there sees this. And we were certainly not the first people to point this out. I think Medical Aid for Palestinians and Doctors Without Borders had also issued press releases about this. So yeah, the psychological devastation is dramatic. There's a woman named Arwa something. I forget her last name, unfortunately. She is I believe, Syrian and Palestinian descent, and she used to work for CNN. Now she runs an NGO that provides comfort to children in war zones in the Middle East. And she told a story about she was speaking with a mother in Gaza, and the mother was telling her that her son, a small child, I think maybe 4 or 5 years old, has severe psychological problems. And then the way she put it was, since he saw her sister's head explode. And this mother went on, and they kept talking. And eventually this lady, Arwa, realized that this mom had also been there when her daughter's head had been blown off. And at some point, this mother realized that Arwa had realized this. And she said, I know what you're thinking, but I have to stay strong, and I can't think about it right now because I have a child who's still alive. These are things that human beings have a limit. They do. And what's going on in Gaza is even before October 7th, was well beyond that limit.
That story you just told literally took my breath away while you were telling it. Now, obviously, when you were in Gaza, you were there as a medic with a huge responsibility to try and patch up the people who are suffering through this incredible carnage and then send them back out into it. What kind of impact did that have on you as a doctor and as a person?
Honestly, I'm used to such things. I'm a trauma surgeon in a town in the United States called Stockton, California. It's a very poor, very rough town. A lot of homelessness, a lot of violence. So I'm actually, it's quite unfortunate, but I'm actually used to that feeling. But I will tell you that so I'm okay. I'll tell you though, everyone else, quite literally everyone else from the trip that I went on has intrusive re-remembering nightmares. I do have dreams about Gaza, but I wouldn't call them nightmares. I don't wake up in a terror or something like that. But they're not pleasant, to be sure. But they're not. I wouldn't say they haunt me. But I'll tell you, if you want to see the effect that this has had on doctors, there was during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. When Kamala Harris was anointed as the Democratic nominee for the presidency, there was a group of doctors that gave a talk, brief talks, and I read off a statement from Dr. Mark Perlmutter. He's a Jewish American surgeon that I was in Gaza with, and he in it he said, I'm forgetting the exact words now, but he said something like, speaking to President Biden and Kamala Harris. I wish you could see the nightmares that haunt us every night. Pictures of children maimed and mutilated, and their inconsolable mothers begging us to save them. If you look at me while I'm giving that talk, Tanya Haj-Hassan, who is, again, also a very seasoned war surgeon, she works with Doctors Without Borders and I believe other groups. She has been to some of the worst places in the world, Sudan, South Sudan. She was in Gaza as well. She starts crying and has to walk away from the frame. It's not some, I don't want to make us out to be victims. We choose to go there, and we should choose to go there because our governments are responsible for what's happening. But no, it does take a toll on a lot of people, and that's honestly one of the things that really motivates a lot of people to try and stop this insanity and this carnage when they come back, because you honestly just can't forget about it. It's impossible. Like I said, I've worked in Ukraine, I've worked in Zimbabwe, I've worked in Haiti. I was there at the Boston Marathon bombing. These are also not forgettable places or forgettable moments. But Gaza is an entirely different thing. You get the sense when you're in Gaza that it is kind of a prelude to the end of humanity in a lot of ways. It's really terrifying. And I don't have children, but if I did, I can only imagine the drive and the need that one would have to stop this kind of insanity from spreading to the rest of the world, or even just 1 inch outside of Gaza.
And you have, in fact, tried very hard to stop this insanity spreading to the rest of the world by holding your leaders accountable. You've tried to arrange meetings between the medical workers who spoke to you or who worked in Gaza, between them and Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, various other people within the Democratic Party. How has that gone?
Unfortunately, as expected, which was it didn't go anywhere. So in July, right after Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, me and 44 other American healthcare workers who'd been in Gaza released a letter to the Biden administration calling for an end to arms sales to Israel, and actually for an arms blockade on the entire region. When I sent that letter, I did receive some, one sentence acknowledgments from lower level staffers at the National Security Council that I sent it to, just saying, thank you for your letter. Of course, the Biden administration continues to work tirelessly for a ceasefire. it went on, and as the anniversary of October 7th approached, we said, "My God, this is still happening." We couldn't believe it. Never would have imagined that it would go on for this long. And so we wrote another letter. It's basically the same letter, just with a little bit of updated language. And but this time, 99 healthcare workers total signed it. Now, I can't think of a time when 99 or almost 100 doctors sent the President of the United States a letter saying that they had witnessed atrocities with their own eyes committed with American weapons by an American ally. I don't think that's happened before, to be perfectly honest. We didn't get so much as an acknowledgement of the letter this time. Literally nothing. I had one meeting maybe 2 weeks ago with I would say a high-level State Department person. These things are supposed to be confidential, so I don't think I should say who they were. And I do know that person has been very actively involved in trying to get the U.S. to change what it's doing in Gaza. That person's been involved in a lot of other major humanitarian actions throughout the world. They're very serious, but they're not having any effect. And I think it's quite obvious why. I'll just tell you, actually, during that meeting and from other meetings I've had with people who work in government, not high level appointees, but they work there. They've all said that it's not. I should stop assuming that all the way up to the highest level of government, people don't know what the Israelis are doing. They said everybody knows exactly what the Israelis are doing. In fact, they probably know worse things than you do, which is not surprising. It's not some secret. I mean, it's hardly a secret that the Israelis have destroyed the entire Gaza Strip, are starving most of the population, are slaughtering a population that is half children, are concentrating them onto the 14% of their territory, making it the most crowded place in the world, putting them into a place, putting 1 million people in a place that has 120 toilets, according to Oxfam. It's just outrageous. This isn't happening anywhere else in the world. And so the U.S. knows what's going on, even all the way up to the Biden administration, meaning all the way up to President Biden and Kamala Harris herself. And they've just decided that based on political calculations, it's not worth it to stop it. That's terrifying. So I'm not so surprised that we didn't get meetings with the administration. And it's kind of funny too, because I think if the administration had met with us and then made a public showing, just saying we met with these doctors and we're gonna, we heard what they said, they wouldn't have had to do anything. They could have easily spun that probably into a victory with Arab Americans in Michigan, probably maybe even won the election. But they're just so fanatically committed to this project of destroying the Palestinians. And why, I couldn't tell you, but it's just obvious that they are. They're just so fanatically committed to it that they wouldn't even do that. They wouldn't even save their own political skin by meeting with a few American doctors. Furthermore, the people we wanted them to meet with are Adam Homowy, who is an American lieutenant colonel, retired, a veteran, and he's famous for saving an American senator's life when she was serving as a soldier in Iraq, Tammy Duckworth. The other person was a Jewish American, Mark Perlmutter. And the third person was me, Feroze, who I'm nobody special, but I've had a New York Times article published. I've been published in Politico. It's kind of shocking, honestly, to see the depth to which, or the incredible dedication of the American political elite, the American ruling class, whatever you want to call them, to this project. It's kind of outrageous. It tells you something about our own society, and this generalizes to the West in general. It's certainly not only the United States, but yeah, and you know better than I do. I'm sure Britain is almost as bad. Canada is almost as bad. Australia is almost as bad. Most of Europe, Germany is maybe the worst.
On that commitment to, in a very striking phrase that you used, a prelude to the end of humanity. Obviously, the government in the US is going to change to perhaps an even more fanatically committed one. Just in brief, what are your thoughts about the future, Feroze?
I don't know what the Trump administration is going to do when it comes in. It's very unlikely that it's just going to all of a sudden cut off arms sales to Israel. That doesn't seem believable. But whether or not the Trump administration can be pushed in certain directions, who knows? People have made a lot of. I believe her name's Miriam Adelson. She's the widow of Sheldon Adelson. a Jewish American casino magnate, and I think it'd be accurate to have called him a pro-Israel fanatic. But she has said basically publicly that her condition for supporting the Trump administration was that Israel gets to annex the West Bank. Well, that's actually already happened. The International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel already annexed the West Bank, and that's why the occupation is illegal, because it's not an occupation, it's just an outright annexation, and that's why they said it has to end. Okay. I mean, I don't know that that's better or worse than having the fictitious nonsense that's been going on under Democratic administrations, like the Oslo process, and then the whatever Obama was doing when he was in office. All of these things are just facades by which the Israelis have been able to buy time and continue colonizing the West Bank and destroying Gaza. Well, okay, if that ends, all the better. At least things will be more honest. But what it means, what the Trump administration means in terms of policy for the Palestinians, I really have no idea. All I know is that me and the other physicians and nurses who've been there will keep pushing for our country to stop acting in this insane and cruel way to these people for no reason.
Was Feroze Sidwha, who spoke to me earlier today. And yeah, I can't get that line, a prelude to the end of humanity, out of my mind when he gives us those grotesque descriptions of injuries in Palestine. But it was also about as gripping and as frank an interview you could ever get about the relation of the US government's foreign affairs apparatus to the Israeli regime. Dalia, Feroze told us a lot about the horrific conditions on the ground in Gaza, but he also revealed that a high up in the State Department said the administration knows not only exactly what Israel is doing, but probably even worse things than we know. What did you make of that?
I mean, first of all, that was like an incredible interview. That, Feroze's, I mean, he seems very humble. I'm sure he would, reject me saying this, but what a courageous man. And I think it's such a stark contrast to the revolting cowardice of Mike Huckabee that we saw in the previous segment. A man who says, I've been to Israel dozens of times, and every single time he's been to Israel, he's been, welcomed with open arms and greeted in, I'm sure, the most luxurious ways by the Israeli state. I would like to see Mike Huckabee spend an hour in a hospital in Gaza and see if he comes out the shill that he went in. In terms of the fact that people high up in the US government, all the way up to President Biden, are aware of what's going on, I'm not surprised. I mean, these people have eyes and ears. They have the same internet that we have. They have the same ability to read and listen to the countless testimonies from every single person that has stepped foot into Gaza, the countless testimonies that corroborate one another on the scale of destruction and devastation that's happening here. The reason that our leaders are not doing anything is not for lack of knowledge. It's not for lack of information. It's for lack of humanity and basic morality. And unfortunately, it comes down to something quite as simple as that. Because one thing that the Israelis and their allies always try and do is they try to use these seemingly benign concepts like neutrality and this idea that, this is a two-side conflict and, you need to get people who are neutral. And there's all kinds of reasons why anyone that has sympathy with the Palestinians is actually just biased. You see it every time an activist or an academic or anyone is introduced in news media. They'll be introduced as a pro-Palestine person, whereas someone who is deeply intertwined with the Israeli project or who is a Zionist will be introduced as some kind of neutral person. Whenever someone comes and says, basic facts about what's happening on the ground in Palestine, they will be accused of being biased, as if, that's the problem with the way that this issue is discussed, when in fact, if there is such a thing as a neutral person, every single neutral person and entity that has stepped foot in Gaza has said not only is this a horror show, but this is an exception to every kind of rule or norm of war that we have ever seen. Even those of us who are experienced in other wartime contexts, what we are seeing here is categorically different. There is complete consensus amongst people who have actually been to Gaza about what is happening. And so when these leaders who will have more information than any of us, whose job it is to understand what's happening, especially when they are the ones who are signing off the military budgets and signing the statements that offer political cover for this genocide. They are the ones who will know more than anyone. They have seen everything that we have seen and more. And so if they can see all of that and still bring themselves to make choices that continue to fuel this genocidal, maniacal machine that is the Israeli state, then you can only assume that they share the genocidal ambitions of that state, because they have the power to withdraw the literal fuel that is fueling this. They have the information. What they don't have is the moral integrity and the absence of a desire to destroy a people. And that is why we are in this situation. No one who is culpable in the genocide that we are seeing, none of our leaders that have been directly and indirectly responsible for the atrocious scenes that we have seen in Palestine over the past year and way before that, none of those people, when the dust settles historically, none of those people will ever be able to say, we just didn't know how bad it was. They knew, and they continue to be complicit, and I can only assume it's because they share the genocidal ambitions of the Israeli state.
Well, certainly, if they don't share those ambitions, as you say, they're now certainly complicit in that genocide in a way that it serves their interests to continue to conceal from us. I mean, the imperative to constantly distort the facts on the ground, to constantly distort what we see on our own, well, not our TV screens so much, but online or on some channels, to distort the testimonies that come out of Gaza, to distort what is happening to even journalists on the ground in Gaza who can't then report what's happening in Gaza. This imperative is completely psychopathic, and it's unimaginable to me where it comes from, what drives it, what the political purpose of this could be. I mean, I can see that at some point, there's an ally and you've got to stand up for them because there's geopolitical interest or whatever, there's a geopolitical advantage to having a good relationship with that country, to preserving that spot in the Middle East. But at this point, there's zero political advantage to continuing to support Israel's, frankly, genocidal campaign against the Palestinians, which is only growing and spreading. Seems completely inexplicable to me. And I really think the shocking thing in what Feroze said was this idea that, in fact, according to this high up in the State Department, things are even worse than we think. Revelations of disaster presumably only to come once Israel's project is complete. What a depressing thought, Dalia.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know what other piece of evidence can be presented to these. We've got testimonies, we've got international agencies that have gone, we've got quotes from Israeli military personnel and politicians boasting about the fact that they shoot anything that moves in the region. What my question to these ghouls in the US and British state and various European state would be, what piece of information from what institution would you need to hear in order to believe that what is happening is wrong? If you can answer that question, let's have a conversation, because there is no form of reputable body or process or protocol for at least incessant war crimes, if not genocide, that hasn't been cleared. I can only assume it's the exact inverse, where it's like, if you say something to them that diverts from the kind of narrativization of what's happening, no matter how much evidence you have to back it up, if you say something that diverts from that narrative, it's assumed to be bias. It's actually the other way around. They're not receiving information and allowing that to influence their position. And when you have that dynamic, it becomes incredibly difficult to think about what we can actually do to strategize to change this policy, because these people are not responding to established protocol, process, and fact. So the question is, what are they going to respond to?
And it's not only politicians who are complicit, it is, of course, the mainstream media as well. And tomorrow we hope to bring you a piece detailing exactly how that complicity functions. Dalia, thank you. I'm sorry to leave you in probably quite a depressed, but perhaps hopefully angry state.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible to see what people around the world are doing, despite the kind of, people like Feroze and like the doctors and people who continue to actually go to Gaza and support the people directly there. I mean, that gives me hope, at least in the future of humanity, even if everything else that's happening doesn't.
Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Please come back tomorrow for another show. For now, I've been Stephen Methven. Good night.